Grace and peace to you. We are in our third week of my book study. We are currently studying the case for the Psalms by N.T. Wright. Earlier this morning, a group of us met over Zoom and we discussed chapter 3 in the book. I was not able to record that Zoom meeting, so I thought I would come to you with a brief recap of our discussion. We know that in this book, N.T. Wright is making a case for the Psalms. He is suggesting that the Psalms invite us into the intersection of our time, space, and matter with God's time, space, and matter. And so we pray these Psalms, we sing these Psalms as God's people have done so for centuries, and by doing so, we can know more fully how our time, how our space, and how our matter intersects with God's. This third chapter focused on time. The chapter is titled "At the Threshold of God's Time." And so in this chapter, N.T. Wright, what he does for us is he reminds us of God's salvation history, essentially. How has God acted in the past? And when we pray the Psalms, we're invited to the answer to that question. How has God acted in the past? And when we look to the past, we're able to know how we fit into the present, and we're able to know more fully what to expect for our future. And so he does a good job of talking about, let's think about our own story and think about how our God has acted in the past. In the very beginning, God created the world. He created human beings to be his vice rulers over this world. We were given that responsibility, and to be honest, we failed. We didn't do the job we were asked to do. We were unfaithful with our vocation as human beings. But you know what? God did not give up on us. He did not rescind the project or our vocation. He would still work through human beings to save not only us. It wasn't just for us, but it was for the whole world that he had created. And the same would be true of Israel. So he talks about, let's look to the history of Israel and the salvation history of God's people. God had chosen a nation. He chose Israel to be his appointed people, through whom all peoples of the earth would be blessed. And guess what? Israel would be unfaithful. They would not always do what was asked of them, but guess what? God didn't give up on Israel. He didn't rescind that project or their vocation. He even writes here in this book, humans have sinned, but God will still work through them. Israel has sinned, but God will still use its people to bless the nations. Monarchs have sinned grievously, but God still promises to bring the world into subjection under his anointed king. So he's saying that we look to the past and we know the ways in which God has acted in the past, and that when we look to the past and we understand those saving deeds of God, we can then know that God will act in the same way now and in the future. And that gives us hope. God is a redemptive God, a God who intends to restore his creation. He didn't just give up on the initial project. And so when we understand that story, and we know our own story, and therefore we know how we fit in this present moment, we're then a part of God's time. We're in God's hands. He says, I love how he says at the end of the chapter, he ends the chapter so well. It says, the past, present, and future belong to him. We are called to live joyfully and painfully and the story that is both his and ours. Our times are in his hand. So that's just a brief recap. The Psalms advise us in the intersection of our time with God's time. And when we know God's time, we know how God has acted faithfully in the past and can expect God to do the same in the future, and that we can therefore look to the future with hope. And that is what the Psalms do for us. It's how the Psalms shape us into the faithful people of God we're called to be. So I hope to see you next week. Next week we will discuss chapter 4. So we'll be looking at space. The title of the chapter is Where God Dwells. So join me next week at the Zoom link in the description below, and we can discuss chapter 4, Where God Dwells. Okay, God bless you.